Thank you for joining on this next part of my series on constructing measures. And today we're going to be talking about designing items when we have constraints. So, whenever we have constraints in the design of items, this can lead to some really interesting dynamics of how do we just make decisions of how to design items for a particular purpose. So, what I'm going to be talking about is designing items with constraints. And so the first thing I want to try to address is what do we mean by constraints? Constraints can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so the most basic, broad definition of constraints when thinking about designing items within assessment is, how much time do I have? Am I required to give an assessment that only takes 5 minutes? Can I develop an assessment that I can do one-on-one interactions with the person or object that I'm assessing? Or am I able to spend an entire day with candidates and go to different locations? And how much time am I able to spend? So it's really this idea of how fast do I need to assess? The next major part is money. A lot of the assessment design process can cost a lot of money. In high stakes educational assessments, especially the big state tests and the large national or international assessments, and each individual item can cost thousands of dollars to develop. And so part of the assessment and design process is how much money do I have to devote to developing, designing items. Part of the money is not only development, but also implementation. How much does it cost to implement a given assessment? I mean, that's one of the interesting parts of having the flexibility and having the forethought when designing items is, what are my constraints on implementation with how much money I have? So, for example, a lot of psychological and educational research, a lot of online surveys are given to where we only have maybe 50 cents to $10 to give to each individual respondent. And so we are limited not only in how long a survey can be, but in how many responses we can get within a given population. And then the last major piece is effort. How much effort am I able to put into the implementation and development process? And so it can be as quick and painless as developing a quick survey within an afternoon, or you can spend years. This gets back to time, but it also gets back to how much effort the developers are able to give. Effort also has to do with, how much effort do I think respondents will be able to give? This will vary by population. You can think of a population of athletes within a assessment of their physical functioning. They'll be highly motivated to put forth as much effort in the assessment as possible to put their best foot forward. Same with in the Olympics when people are being assessed on their performance on ice skating. Or you can have very low effort when you're going through and designing an assessment where people can go through and click responses very quickly, so the effort on the respondent is low. And that's one of the interesting things we have to think about when designing assessments and designing items is, what is the effort that we have, not only on our part as the developers, but also on the respondents. So that's one of these three key pieces of thinking about the constraints we have placed in developing an assessment. So what I'm going to do is go through an idea of physical, or the example of physical function. Physical functioning provides a really unique example of the flexibility and the possible constraints we have with designing assessments. So I think one of the most straightforward ways that we can think about to directly assess how well someone is functioning physically is to directly do task. Now, this creates a really interesting dynamic where we can have people. This is going to be my amazing drawing skills coming out. Of, well, can they move? He's actually holding this. The person's not very good, but he's holding a 50-pound block, and he has to move it over here, and then set it down. And so, one of a direct task to see if someone can do. This is a terrible box. If someone can move a box of a certain weight, is have them perform that physical task. And if they can do it, we would assess them as yes or no. And so we have a very straightforward interpretation of the results of the assessment. They can either do it or they cannot. Now, we can think of in the hypothetical, in like almost the perfect world of if we have a large list of candidates or a large number of people we're going to assess, this might become difficult. Well, how many people do I need to move an object? How far? And that gets into this constraint of possible space. Are there space restrictions and constraints on how much area I'm able to do? And when we're having people directly conducting different tasks, well, which tasks are we going to select? This gets into a time. We can think of this 50-pound moving task as very appropriate in certain situations. Well, what if we want to have them run? He's running really fast and trying to get to a finish line. Trying to run quickly. And so running, that is another way of directly assessing a type of functioning. Another is walking. Another is like, can they bathe themselves? This is going to be my amazing attempt at drawing a shower. Ooh, this is a really bad tub. Okay, yes, there we go. There we go, now we got a shower. Can you shower yourself? And one of the difficulties of, because these are different degrees of functioning, we can think of people that have a very low functioning can hopefully at least bathe themselves, maybe only be able to walk instead of run, and then maybe not be able to move heavy objects. And so these are different tasks that we can consider, but they have a very straightforward interpretation. The last one of showering has a potential limitation and constraint of being awkward. I don't know who, when you're conducting assessments, but I would find it very strange to have my shower routine watched and observed to see if I'm doing it to a sufficient standard. And so the constraint we have has nothing to do with the feasibility of actually doing the task, but a social constraint of, well, should we actually do this? And now we have social constraints. This becomes a really important issue in assessing certain types of psychological phenomena, especially in terms of trauma. And, well, how do we ask questions and ask about past events without triggering trauma responses and having people go into states of shock? These are important constraints and considerations we have to have when designing assessments. So if we're assessing physical functioning and we can't actually have people perform all these tasks, even though it would be by far the most robust and most direct way of seeing if they can do these different tasks to assess their functioning. As we said, we just don't have as much time and money to implement all these things, all these different tasks. Maybe we don't have hours upon hours to do it. And there's, of course, the limitation of how many of these tasks you can actually fit in within a reasonable amount of time. So now, instead of having them conduct the tasks, we just ask them if they can do the tasks. So now we're not just asking people to do a task, we're asking if they can do a task. we're getting their self-assessment. One of the powerful parts of doing a self-assessment is you can ask individuals about a lot more different types of tasks instead of having to set up a type of room and environment so they can do the moving blocks and run and showering or walking. Now we can ask them a much larger and much more diverse set of tasks. That's the benefit. It's easier to ask more. And so we can get a much broader perspective on their physical functioning. But again, our constraint is that we're giving up the direct information, direct observation of them conducting these assessments and these skills and tasks. And so we have to do a trade-off. We can ask about more things more quickly, but we don't get to directly observe whether they can do the task. We have to rely on their self-reporting and their self-assessment of being able to do different tasks. So this is where different constraints fall into place of, well, do we ask about it or do we have them do it? This becomes a really important part of a lot of different types of assessment, especially in education, where we ask people about certain types of knowledge or their ability to do certain tasks. Sometimes we can only ask in vague generalities about them, such as like their writing and knowledge of grammar. One of the best ways to assess whether someone can write is to have them write. But it becomes very tedious to grade and assess a large number of writing prompts. So we just create a small number of direct writing prompts, but then we ask like multiple choice questions to help limit or help increase the number of items and number of tasks that we have. So that's part of the constraints that we have on our assessment, is going between, can we directly do a task? Do we need to ask about it? And then how do those different limitations relate to our constraints on time and money and effort, not only on development, but on the respondent as well. For instance, there are certain types of populations that having them actually conduct these assessments would just not be even physically possible, because there's so few that they could actually do, because maybe they're stuck in a hospital bed. Well, we can still ask them about small numbers of functions, small limits within what they can do, but maybe we don't have the space to have them conduct any of the tasks. But we still care about whether they can function independently. And that's one of the powerful parts of thinking, doing a lot of forward thinking about what are the constraints to have on my assessment, and then also how does that relate to what decisions I need to make about people. Because if we're doing a research design where we are only interested in physical functioning in the general, about individual differences in physical functioning, but we don't need to have anyone actually conduct any of the tasks in the future, we just want to know if they can, it becomes very useful to ask about a lot of different tasks and have lots of variability in responses across the population, so that we can then relate physical functioning to other outcomes and causes and predictors. But if we are developing and selecting candidates for a particular job or a particular position within a team or a certain type of performance, well, we want to know if they can actually do the tasks that we're asking about. And that becomes a back and forth constraint of, well, can we ask them? And do we have the time to do these? That's one of the powerful parts and most inflexible parts of doing kind of these performance assessments within, say, acting. Well, part of the job application you can think of as an assessment of their acting ability and fit in a particular role. They have to actually act out and do part of the script in performance to see if they fit. So it's a direct mapping on to the decisions that we want to make. And that is what I want to end today on, is how do the constraints relate to decisions. And that's something to think about when designing items is, well, how do the constraints relate to what I can design? And how do those limitations impact what decisions I want to make? So thank you for joining in. Please like and subscribe, and let me know if you have any questions.